Welcome back to another episode of Hodinkee Radio. Our guest today is editor and writer Jay Fielden. Jay is a media industry veteran, having spent time at The New Yorker, Vogue, and Men's Vogue before becoming editor in chief of Town and Country. From there, he took the same position at Esquire from 2016 to 2019. He's even contributed to Hodinkee a few times over the years. We invited Jay on to talk mostly about his recent excellent piece, The Strange Journey of John Lennon's Stolen Patek Philippe Watch, which appeared in the June 24 issue of The New Yorker. It's the most detailed account yet of the Lennon 2499 that has remained mostly a mystery for decades. He traces the story, talks to the people, and even found some never-before-published photos of the Patek given by Yoko Ono to Lennon for his 40th birthday, just months before he was murdered. Also joining our conversation is our very own Ben Clymer. So without further ado, Jay, how are you doing today?
Excellent, man. Great to be with you guys.
Thanks so much for coming on. Ben, first of all, let the people hear your voice. How are you doing today, too?
I'm doing great, Tony. I'm very excited to be here. I've known Jay a long time. His intro didn't really do justice to who this man is. This guy is the best dinner guest you could have at any party at all times. Just a legendary New York media guy, and so happy that this story was kind of brought to life through you and the New Yorker of all places. I mean, what an amazing outlet for a watch story, you know.
Thank you, Ben. That's very, very kind of you. I really appreciate it. And you're not so
Of
bad
course.
with dinner.
No, appreciate it.
Jay, it's a long time coming, I'm sure. What's the feedback been like in the week or so since it's been published online, and then obviously in print subsequent to that?
Extraordinary, to say. I mean, I like I say, I anticipated a lot just because I knew that how much interest there was in this watch in particular, and obviously John Lennon. Outside of that, and getting some of the stuff that I got to, I felt it would pique people's interest, but it being in the New Yorker, obviously the New Yorker process of getting it right, and the editing. I had a great editor there named Susan Morrison, somebody I've known for a long time, who really took it under her wing, and it's I pretty much heard from everybody I wanted to hear from, if you know what I'm saying. Like you have your thoughts as a writer. You think, I hope this rings their bell, and it rang a lot of bells. I heard from people, certainly many magazine people, writing people in the book world, the movie world, the documentary world, just people that I admired in the past who are writers or editors or things like that, really enjoying it. And I knew it would break the barrier of the watch wall, so to speak. It would push through that, which is what interested me in the story in some ways at the beginning. Is I wanted to tell a watch story, but I wanted to tell a story that would be emblematic of the moment we're in with watches, or have been in over the really Ben's career is, I think, spans the time that I think is very fascinating in watches in terms of what happened with watches from roughly '08 up until now. And I wanted to find this quintessential story that would somehow be a keyhole into a lot of it. I don't think I got to everything in the 4,000 words that I was allotted, but I got to touch on those, and I certainly did a lot of other reporting and research, which took me into the highways and byways of the narrative.
Before we get completely into the Lennon story, Ben mentioned it, media industry veteran, legend, really, 30 plus years in the business. I'm curious, though, when watches come into play for you. Just your story with watches, your connection to watches throughout your life.
Yeah, well, it's so much of this story is serendipitous in terms of the way it echoes backward into previous experiences or relationships or friendships or things like that. And I'll touch on those as we go along. But one of them would be, I grew up in San Antonio in Texas, and as a high school kid, I worked in a polo shop there, one of the early polo shops outside of New York. I don't know why, but Texans love Ralph Lauren, and I loved it at the time. This was the late '80s, and so I got a job there, and I immediately noticed one of the things that Ralph did, as you guys probably remember, was there were vintage watches for sale at the stores, and vintage watches in the ads, the bubble backs especially, and the duodial Rolex. Most of the stuff was Rolex, but those two eras, a kind of Art Deco era, and I immediately noticed that in the ads. And then when I worked in the shop, a couple of the watches came through. And, when I later got to go to New York and then went to school in Boston and all that, I worked again at Ralph Lauren during college in Boston, and same thing. So I was noticing these watches. I didn't go into it like, oh man, I want to know everything about this. I mean, I didn't know there was that much to know about it. I just knew, a bubble back Rolex was beautiful, and a Rolex is a beautiful thing. And so I started getting interested then, and it led me to want to go to flea markets and buy the vintage watches I could afford at the time, which were like the Benrus models that I wrote about for you guys not so long ago, things like that. And now I'm back working at Ralph Lauren again. I'm the kind of the editorial director by way of contract. I'm a freelance guy there, but I do a lot of work for them. So it's funny that it just comes back around. You know, the things that like really bit you when you were a kid, for me at least, have lasted that whole time. And then this gave me a chance to really realize in the last, you know, being the editor of Men's Vogue, being the editor of Town and Country, Esquire, that obviously we covered watches. When we were covering watches at Men's Vogue, I think, and Ben would probably remember this a bit, it there was a little bit of a sense of like, are these things going to continue to be of interest? That was the first time that I got to go to what was then called SIHH and see the, you know, intense community of people who love these things and produce these things. And I loved it, but I felt at the time that it was very much a little bit like bespoke tailoring, which was going through the same thing. There was a feeling that it was in the nursing home. It was going to be over pretty soon. And then suddenly, you know what? No, it wasn't over, and it kind of rocketed even further. So watches was always in the back of my, you know, not say in the back, but it was always around in terms of the editorial stuff we did. I had really expert guys who wrote about it, knew the numbers and the, you know, the reference numbers and things like that in a way that I didn't quite know. But I was in it, and I began to really study it, learn the other marks, understand, I think in a more sophisticated way, what a great watch is, what a great looking watch is, and it kind of just has continued to go from there.
I'm always curious for a guy like you who ran Esquire, Town and Country, worked at various other publications. Watches are but one piece of obviously the things that you cover there, part of sort of the lifestyle that you guys cover. But for a guy like you, what sets apart watches as like eh, more interesting? I suppose even accepting the premise of this question, but what sets them apart is more interesting, and as we'll get into, would make you even want to pursue a story about John
Yes.
Lennon's watch, which is kind of an esoteric thing, I suppose.
Yeah. Look, I love them aesthetically. I love them as just a thing that is a luxury object, being careful about how to use that word. You know, I just was interested in them as things of beauty, you know, of mystery, of you know what you guys suffer from. I can't totally explain why these things are enchanting, but they are. So there was that level of it. But then I also, you know, I've always tried to keep a leg out of any of the deep, you know, intense worlds that I go into, whether it was fashion or wine or cars or art or what have you, to try to, you know, keep a journalistic eye on it. And I've been around long enough to see moments arrive for certain subjects that in which those subjects break through the aficionado column in a newspaper or a magazine and start to find their way onto the front page. And I think that began to happen with watches with the Newman auction, and some other things with I think, to be honest with you, with the phenomenon of a thing like Hodinkee, you know, becoming not just a blog, but a business that people noticed, admired, wished they had started themselves, myself included, you know. So seeing things like that, I began to think, okay, there's people out there who know a little bit about watches. They know their granddad maybe had a cool Rolex that they inherited or their dad got, or in a safety deposit box. You know, these things are around enough as name brands that people are aware of them in general. But now you had things like, what, you know, Paul Newman's watch going for $18 million. What was that about? The pricing on the secondary market became interesting. The Bloomberg subdial index became interesting. People getting robbed for their watches became interesting. It started to become, I just felt it in my bones as a journalist. This is a story people are going to want to understand and kind of just get a handle on whether they call themselves watch people or not.
Yeah, and I think just to hop in a little bit, I think from my vantage point, like I look at like the moments that really made watches a thing, and I mean I appreciate those kind of words about Hodinkee, but like putting that aside, like it was Apple Watch. Like when Apple Watch came out, to this day, the number one most popular story we have ever published was my initial review of the Apple Watch the day it came out from Cupertino. And it's like that changed things for the whole industry. And then absolutely right, Paul Newman's Paul Newman. And I really believe that this, this story, which is ongoing, and I'm sure you'll tell us in what ways, I think this has the potential to be the next kind of catalyst to put watches even further. Like the fact that Paul Newman's watch, I always view it as singular because it's Paul Newman, it's a Rolex, everybody can understand it. Like it made a lot of sense. And then it sold obviously for so much money. I thought we were kind of done. I didn't really realize that the Lennon watch, which I've known about for a long time, obviously, like would have some sort of way of taking things even further. The fact that it's a Patek Philippe, which like, okay, now people know what Patek is. 5 years ago, like I'm not so sure they did. Like before COVID and before that, a Nautilus and an Aquanaut were like pretty esoteric things that were, okay, you guys knew about it being in New York and Chicago and being into this world, but most people didn't really know what Patek is. Now I think they do because of these sports watches. But you taking it even further with Lennon's connection, and of course the 2499 being kind of, it's the archetype of a watch, and like that is the watch, that reference. If it were any other watch, it might not be as so salient and so kind of like frankly magnificent to the story. I really view this as kind of potentially what pushes the idea of what watches are into the next phase of growth.
I think you're right about Patek, and a couple of thoughts on that. One is I think yes, it's a brand you're aware of, or many people are aware, but it's a little bit like the violet flavored macaroon or something. And when you go to Paris, or that it's you realize it's a acquired taste a bit. It's not like what anyone. It's almost anyone could like. I think a Submariner, but Patek I think is a little bit. The designs are a little bit strange at first. I mean, perhaps in the sense that they're more unusual, unexpected, and that was part of what I was interested in too. Obviously about the name, what it meant in 1980. Of course, one of the big questions I wanted to try to answer was why did Yoko Ono get this watch for John Lennon, a man who I've seen wear a watch once in a photograph, and it was back in, I think, when they were playing in Hamburg, and who knows what it was, right? But never again did I ever see a watch on his wrist. So how did he not only end up with a Patek, but end up with that one? Was one thing I really wanted to try to find out. And I wanted to understand it, especially during 1980, and kind of think about what was that watch then, and I think I say something like it was a symbol of lockjawed taste. I assume it was kind of like something, that you would have seen John Houseman wearing in the Paper Chase, or, something, or, in fact, I think it is in, Dan Aykroyd wears it in Trading Places. Doesn't he talk about Patek? I'm pretty sure he does, right? That's the kind of thing you might have associated it with, right? The same guy who wants to talk about the weather in 1961 in Bordeaux was probably, buying a Patek watch. Now that's different, wildly different, but it still left a real mystery of a question for me to try to answer about a guy like John Lennon ending up with one.
Jay, I'm going to ask you this question, Ben. I'll throw it to you as well. But how long have you even known about the Lennon 2499? How long has it been a curiosity of yours, Jay? And then I want to hear from you too, Ben.
I think it was when I was at Esquire. It was just looking. It might have even, something around the time that Ben had written a piece for you guys. I think 2015, 2016, of kind of the, the watches that we don't know, or where they are, kind of thing. And I know that was part of it. And then that was obviously ping ponged around. I mean, whether it was the first. I know it had been started to be mentioned around 09 or 10, but it's just one of those things that occurred again and again. You probably remember it was a little bit maybe even of a clickbait thing when you didn't have anything else to write. I mean, I don't mean you, but I saw it in GQ. I saw it in Le Monde. I saw it over and over and over again. Any opportunity to somehow say a little something about that watch and use that photograph that Bob Gruen took, there was reason to do it, and reason for me to be interested in the sense of like I couldn't believe the photograph never got credited. I mean, we live in this age of this going on, but being at Esquire, I knew things like GQ running that photograph without crediting it was strange. Le Monde running that it was strange. Big news organizations don't let that kind of stuff slip through the cracks. So I didn't get it. It was one of the things I just was like, I want to know who took the photograph. And that's where it really began with me. I'll just try to find out who took the picture.
For me, I remember very clearly where I was when I first heard about it. I was at the Soho House in New York in 2009, 2010, back when Soho House was like, I thought it was pretty cool being at Soho House back then. I was with a guy named Charles Turrell, who at the time was running Antiquorum in New York, I believe, and he was one of kind of my first friends at Vintage Watches. And he said, "Buddy, you got to see this picture." And he pulls up this picture of that picture of John Lennon with a 2499. And I was like, "Holy shit. Like, what is this?" I thought it was a doctored photograph. Like, how could I have not, like all I did back then was hunt the internet for pictures of cool people wearing watches. And I just couldn't believe it. And at the time, I mean, we were still almost a decade away from locating Paul Newman. So the idea of like a Lennon 2499 was just, it was unfathomable. And so, that watch, like you, that photo kind of like lived in the back of my mind until I put together that story. I just pulled it up. It was 2014. Actually, it was 10 years ago this month that I wrote this story of like the great missing watches. It included the Lennon 2499. It included obviously the Newman. It included Marlon Brando's Rolex from Apocalypse Now, et cetera, et cetera. And when I wrote that story, that was a story that did incredibly well for us on the site. And it's funny you mentioned the photo credit. I have image via Beatles photo blog. Not the
Yeah, that's right. I might have looked that up.
Yeah, exactly. But just the idea of
that's some kind of credit. I don't know.
Yeah, it is a credit.
Yeah.
The Beatles photo blog is just crushing it on that. But the idea again that like this watch existed, as you said, like 1980. So I mean, just in full clarity. So like I was born in 1982. I have long wanted to own a Patek Philippe, a Rolex, and a Porsche from 1982. I was able to buy a Rolex that I deemed worthy of me from 1982, but finding a Porsche or a Patek Philippe from 1982 is next to impossible because it was an absolute dark point in the history of luxury goods, frankly. Like just nobody cared about Patek Philippe. Nobody cared about Porsche. They were all struggling at that point. So the idea of Yoko walking in, as you mentioned in the article, into a Tiffany and buying like what was absolutely one of the most expensive watches in the catalog in 1980 is just shocking. And again, if it were any other reference, if it was a Nautilus, it frankly wouldn't be that big of a deal. And of course, the Nautilus was made in 1980. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. If it was anything else, just a chronograph or just a perpetual, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the 2499 strikes that balance with people like me who love watches just as much as somebody would love pop culture, of just combining everything into one kind of perfect storm of a story.
Yes. And look, I did talk to Tiffany, and even though they don't have records that are that specific, like they don't have the receipt from that era, but they're were very certain that there were more watches in that glass case that were Patek watches that day. That summer, that fall. So again, that was one, just chills up the spine, man. That thing was in the case, okay, sitting there, number one, right? But there were other things too that she could have said, oh, why not that one? Why not this one? Why that? Why this? I mean, obviously I try to find that out, and I found some things that aren't in the article that I couldn't confirm to the degree that the New Yorker would like, that I may in the future. But that was obviously a great curiosity about what led her eye to that particular watch.
You mentioned the photo and the crediting of the photo, which is kind of in a way how this story begins, and you eventually find that it was actually the famous rock photographer, basically Bob Gruen, who took the photo, funny enough. And that's kind of where the story jumps off in a way for you. But I think you have a little sort of vignette almost from when you talked to him and just kind of what he remembers about that evening, which isn't much, but he added a little bit of color and context from the photo itself that we didn't have previously.
So the way I just try to reconstruct it, I'm looking at this picture, I'm thinking, number one, I don't know, it looks as if it could have been a family snapshot, doesn't it? I mean, that there was that possibility. Could have been that. Maybe I'd never find who took it. So I just started thinking around that time, if we go with this idea, which is interesting, that somebody did figure out it was a birthday gift. I'm not sure whoever figured that out and how they established that, to be honest, because why would they know that? So I thought, who would have been around at that time? Who might know something? I just literally made a list. I started reading the biographies. I started, just trying to recreate, almost like I assumed somebody would in a murder investigation, who was around him, who would have been the one to give an alibi, so I tracked down the producer of the album Double Fantasy, which Ono had just finished, and it was this guy Jack Douglas, who's also quite a noted rock producer. Did all of Cheap Trick stuff, did Aerosmith, all that kind of stuff. So I somehow got his email. I emailed him. He's very fast on email. He doesn't want to talk on the phone, but he'll email you all day long. And I emailed him the picture, and I just said, they took that. And like 5 seconds later, it came back and said Bob Gruen took that. So then I said, "Do you have Bob Gruen's number? Or email?" I said, "Yeah, here's the thing." And he told me, obviously, "Yeah, I used to swing by all the time in the Hit Factory. They recorded really late at night. I had an open invitation there." I mean, he photographed them a lot, so it was totally believable. And then he, said that kind of little beautiful thing where he'd been to somebody else's birthday party that night. He brought him some birthday cake. I mean, it's funny again, just telling you how little the watch at that time was of interest to many people, where, as he said, they didn't talk. He doesn't remember them talking about it. He remembers being very dazzled by the pen, the tie pen, which was made of diamonds and rubies and sapphires, probably from Tiffany, though I couldn't, everybody assumes it's Tiffany, and Tiffany has made a flag pen like that for years. But it's hard to know whether it was Tiffany or not. It makes sense it would be. But so everybody was involved, interested in the pen and the tie that Ono had uh, uh, the tie that was resembled the one he wore as a high school kid in Liverpool, and that she had knitted for him. That was kind of what it was about. And even as I then followed up with Jack Douglas about, he wasn't even that impressed with that watch. He had the Porsche Chronograph 1 on, which would have been very cool at that time, right? So he thought he had the cool watch, and that I imagine he looked at the watch that John had and thought, God, you got a granddad's watch. You might as well have a pocket watch and wear a 4-piece suit.
Truly.
Before we get into the story itself, was there a part that was a piece of the puzzle that was particularly hard for you to sort of put together or puzzle out?
The part of like where it came from to begin with, I just was interested in that. I wanted to know the A to Z part of the story. I wanted to know the genesis of it as well as the end game, so to speak. So that was difficult, and I haven't totally figured it out. I mean, when I talked to Sean Lennon, I don't think he knows why his mother got that watch in particular. He wasn't evasive about it when we were talking. I just don't think it's something he's not particularly interested in, watches or stuff. He's a lot like his dad, as he even told me. I'm even more extreme than my parents are. His thinking about them is that they didn't like, quote unquote stuff, i.e., luxury objects. I mean, they had some things, obviously. He had some guitars, for instance. He had some nice things. But yeah, you don't think of John Lennon as a guy who was just, living like a king, right? Beyond having, yes, apartments and people, to work for you. But you know what I mean? He was not just an acquisitive guy, it doesn't seem like. And Sean is not very acquisitive either. So I couldn't crack that part. It was obviously hard to find Mr. A. And it was hard to understand exactly, I think there's more to do in terms of the two guys who have been implicated in stealing the watch. I was not able to get to them. I think that they heard from me in terms of the way that I sent them messages, but they never responded to me. So I think there's more to that story, that part of the story. And then what happened to it exactly at Christie's, I think is also, there's more there, which I would like to find out.
Well, I want to kind of just jump through all of those way stops almost, if we can, for the
Yeah.
next little bit, because as you mentioned, it kind of starts with Karsan, Mr. Karsan, who was for years and years Yoko Ono's driver, and he is essentially the one who is implicated in the original theft of the watch, and that's really where the story picks up in 2005, 2006. And I think that's kind of where the story picks up for you as well, after the original photograph that Bob Gruen took way back in 1980, I suppose.
Yes. I mean, I was able to figure out that after Lennon was killed, and I was told, and this, I couldn't confirm this, but this is interesting, as in conversational, in terms of conversational facts. I can't know it, but I heard it from a couple of people that he was wearing the watch when he was killed, and I caution that being repeated as fact because I don't know it, but I heard it from enough people to make me think that there's enough validity there to want to hunt it down, to see if that's true. But I knew that after that happened, the watch was basically put away in mysteriously a quote unquote locked room in the Dakota, and it sat there as best as I can understand it, for almost 25 years. And it was then in 2005, fast forward to '05, Yoko Ono has a driver at that time in her employ who had been her driver for almost 10 years at that point, which is a pretty long time to work for her. A guy who was grew up in Turkey. Apparently, I've heard it from a few people, might have been part of the Turkish Secret Service at some point, seemed to have skills. He was a big guy, 6'2", 6'3", as I've heard him described. You can see pictures of him. I found some pictures of the two of them when he's, acting as a kind of bodyguard, which he also claimed he was for her. Believable. He's a gigantic guy, least intimidating. They have a falling out. I didn't go into as much detail as I can a bit now, but it appears he was grousing about having to be on call 24/7 for her, and he didn't feel like he was getting paid the proper amount for the time he spent, I guess, what you would technically call overtime. And apparently his argument had been that he had tried to address this with her a number of times, that she basically ignored his angry at a certain point in, I believe it's December of 2005, that he, no, December of 2007 or six. Okay. That he gets so angry, he threatens her and says basically that and this touches on his possible, intelligence service experience. He had been recording conversations secretly that she had been having and taking photographs of her as the story went, and threatened to expose these things to the public unless she paid him $2 million. He was promptly arrested, arraigned in several pretrial hearings. He claimed some bizarre things, that he was her lover. She obviously denied that strenuously. He said that she had ruined his life, and he tried to kind of claim, I guess, what he was claiming before, that he was an abused employee. I don't think either party was interested in going through something like that as a trial, so he was allowed to plead to a lesser grand larceny or extortion, and was deported to Turkey. When he went to Turkey, he took the watch, and he took some other things with him at the same time that he would later claim were entrusted to him and he assumed were gifts. So that's where the watch then leaves the United States, leaves the Dakota, and goes to Europe. And I would just say that she will not know that the watch is gone from the Dakota for another 9 years after that happened.
Did you? I remember when I was looking into this, there are almost daily reports on the whole ordeal between Ono and Karsan around this time. It was, kind of tabloid fare at the
Yes.
time. Did you learn anything else about their relationship or dig into anything else on that aspect of the story? It's always been something that's a curiosity of mine, if nothing else.
Sean did say some things to me that I couldn't get into the piece. I mean, he just remembered him, and one description he gave him, and he said it could be raining or snowing, and we would be coming out to get in the car, and he was always smiling at me no matter what was going on. And he obviously meant that in a wicked way. He didn't mean he was nice and friendly and made it warm. He felt he was hiding something, a kind of Cheshire cat smile, I think, is the way he was conveying that. And he just, I think it was clear he was scared of him and thought he was capable. As he said to me, he said, I didn't know he was capable, but I felt he was capable of doing something bad. And he went on again and again about the advantage he felt that Karsan had taken of his mother, that, a small Japanese woman, as he put it, elderly at that time, a widow, and this big man who had been basically given an open invitation into their life, into all of the apartments. He had keys to all the different apartments they had there. He had keys to this locked room, which came out later, and who took this kind of advantage of her. And he said to me, of all the different people who had taken advantage of them, and there were many, there are a number of examples of people taking things from them, that this is kind of the most bidder in his memory. So that's about as far as I could get with what went on, but I think that gives you a sense of maybe, I did ask him this too. I'll just add this. He made the point that most people who ended up working for his parents were people that they ended up kind of just meeting. He said people would come to my the apartment door, knock on the door to deliver something or give us something or get an autograph or something like that. And my parents would say, hey, you look cool. You're nice. We have, we need some people to work for us. It does kind of seem like that. If you read, who was working for them, they were kind of people that they just kind of, I don't know, thought were kind of cool or cool looking or something. And so he said, my parents were so open. They were so naive. And so I did ask him, I said, well, then how did Karsan get hired? Because he's not a guy that was coming up for an autograph or taking a picture of Yoko Ono when she was going into the Dakota. And he couldn't remember. And he said, that's a good question. I should know the answer to that. My sense is he was probably hired in some professional way. Like he just had the chops to be not only a driver, but a protector. And that was probably how it started. And why he was able to record so many conversations surreptitiously. He had, as I've heard, and again, Sean even mentioned it, he must have had some training.
When Karsan is deported to Turkey, the watch comes with him. The next time it bubbles up almost to the public even is when it comes to kind of this startup-y really auction house called Auctionata in Berlin, a handful of years later. If you could just kind of talk a little bit about how it got there. And then I think one of the things that you did was talked to the young at the time, at least, specialist who was there, one Mr. Hoffman, I think, and sort of what you learned from him about how they took the watch in and what they thought about the Lennon watch when it came to their door.
So yeah, it goes to Turkey. Karsan reconnects instead of connects with a man who was from his village somewhere around Bodrum, which is on the coast, very beautiful part of Turkey. He gets interested in wanting to buy a house, but apparently doesn't have the full amount of money to buy it. He makes a deal with this friend who's known as Erhan G. I know who he is, but let's use that name, Erhan G. Erhan G is a successful man who lives in Berlin, might have even owned the house that he sold to Karsan. I'm not sure. It's unclear to me. But the point is, Karsan can only come up with what looks to be around $500,000. He still needs another $250 to fully purchase the house. He asks the friend if maybe the watch can be collateral for the remaining part of the debt. The friend obviously agrees. The watch ends up in Berlin. This man, Erhan G., like I say, he's successful. He's got an apartment on Potsdamer Platz, which is kind of the center of Berlin. In other words, not an inexpensive place to live. He owns a successful business. The business, which I don't name in the New Yorker, but is interesting to me, is a refurbisher of shipping pallets. Okay, so this is where he's made his money, and he's got an interest in watches, and I think he begins he's kind of known. I think you guys want to understand this in the auction world, and this is partly what the piece starts to go into here, and I think it go a lot further. Is auctions, new auctions, old auction houses, whatever, they identify the people who are interested in buying these kinds of things. I think this guy was somebody who was interested in that kind of stuff, had bought some stuff, not extremely expensive stuff, but maybe watches that were 30,000-40,000 euros, something like that. So he has, I believe, a relationship with Auctionata. And at some point, it's unclear to me whether he owns the watch at this time fully, though I think he does, and I think that's what we go with. He wants to sell the watch. So he bragged about it, I think, with somebody who worked at Auctionata one day. The way it was put to me is that they got drunk at a vintage car event. And one of these guys who was a big deal at Auctionata at the time palled around with him that night, and Erhan G ends up mentioning that he has this watch that was John Lennon's. And so pretty soon after that, the watch is consigned to Auctionata. Auctionata at the time is, yes, as you described, I think what Christie's and Sotheby's have turned themselves into now. Basically, they just did it too fast, and they did it kind of perhaps not as by not following the guidelines they should follow. But they were a darling in Germany. I mean, the German press at that time talks about Auctionata as if it were Nvidia today or something like that. This is like a big deal. This is one of the hot .coms, and they're going to reinvent the auction business. And
we actually, sorry to interrupt, we actually worked with them extensively when they were around. So they were one of the, I think probably the first to do like live auctions.
Yeah.
So like people would be on camera saying, here's the Patek 2499, and it'd be like circling, and it would be like a live feed while they were taking bids. I'm actually just searching my email from, I conversed with Hoffman many times.
Oh, you did?
Oh yeah, no, many.
Yeah.
I mean, look, they were,
like
they were around. We were,
yeah.
It's they were really, really hot, and then they went to zero very quickly.
What about Alexander Zaki?
I don't know. Let me take a look.
He was the one who was the CEO. Well. So anyway, they're doing. It's got a lot of press. There's a lot of money that's been put into about $100 million of venture capital from places like Hearst Ventures and Bernard Arnault's one of his venture capital. So it's just a lot going on there. And then some weird news starts to creep out that maybe they're bidding on their own auctions and this, that, and the other. And then the CEO at the time was this guy named Alexander Zaki. He was really pushing for the Lennon watch to be sold. I think with an eye on this other trove of Lennon items that this is, if you could keep track of this, sorry. If we go back to when Karsan was deported, he took the watch, but he also took some other stuff. That other stuff included several diaries from the last 5 years of John Lennon's life that he kept in New Yorker desk journals. Okay, so those old things with cartoons in them that you'd get from the New Yorker and keep your, in the old days when you'd have a desk diary. John Lennon turned those into daily journals, and the journals are highly speculated upon about what's in them in terms of his thoughts about his former bandmates and his marriage and a lot of other things. So anyway, he took some of those with him. So now, again, let's go back to Auctionata. The watches at Auctionata, I think it's pretty clear that Zaki knew that this other stuff was maybe something he could get his hands on too. And you guys will love this. This is 2014. So, at that time, the Patek 2499 is probably a really good, and, Ben, obviously tell me what you think, a really good example. Is probably selling for around $1 million.
Probably a little bit less, but either way.
Probably not even that much, right? So in a certain way, now it's hard to remember these things, but I think throughout the story, it's important to remember, to take off what we know now and go back to that time. Zaki, I think, realized that these diaries and these other things were going to be worth much more. So he kept, there's a reason, the point that I needed to figure out at Auctionata was why they didn't get in touch with Yoko Ono, which they didn't do. And why wouldn't you do that? They did a few things that they felt made it legally, I guess, not so much, I don't know if it was so much legal as it was giving the provenance a story of a watch, and that was to establish a few facts about it. They got an extract from Patek, which made them feel that, oh, well, it's clearly not been stolen because we couldn't get the extract if it was. That's not a really great way of finding out whether something had been stolen, but
anyway, that's not a thing at all.
Yeah, there was that. And then they got Karsan to sign a sworn document that said how he got the watch, and his claim then, and this is where echoes reverberate back into the story here and there and everywhere, is that, okay, if we go back to when he was working for Yoko Ono, his story was before we had the falling out, it's 2005, and she came to me one day and said, I'd like to give you something because you've been a loyal employee of mine. I'd like you to choose a watch. And so, according to him, he went into the room and he chose a watch, and it was the Patek 2499. She later would say, yeah, I told him to take a watch, but he knew not to take that watch. So that's just one thing that's just a weird kind of like he said, she said, not totally clear what happened. But the point is, Auctionata is getting ready to auction the watch. I think they freak out a little bit that, like, oh my God, what if Yoko Ono finds out about this? she's not only going to possibly ruin the auction of the watch, but then we'll never get that other stuff to auction. So let's just do private treaty, a sale by private treaty. So they find Mr. A, Oliver Hoffman. You brought him up. He's the young, quite young. I think he's 29 at the time, in the watch department. He is instructed to find somebody on who will buy it private treaty. He finds a man who he knew from his journeys in the watch world, and the watch was sold for 600,000 euros, and a agreement to consign 40 more watches. And that's kind of what happened at Auctionata, as I know it.
Before we get to Mr. A, who I want to hear more about from your perspective, I think the point in which I was reading your story in the New Yorker when I first kind of was like, holy shit, there it is, was the photo you unearthed from Auctionata. Because in the process, I think of preparing to take it for public auction, as you tell in the story, they had taken a photo of it, and a nice beautiful photo in sort of this vacuous black space, as you might expect in an auction catalog. But that's the reaction I had when I saw it in the New Yorker. I'm curious, when you uncovered it in your reporting, kind of just the reaction you had to finally seeing these photos of the watch.
Well, thank God was what I said, because I had seen a photo through someone else, but
Okay.
this person was very nervous about, in any way being a part of the story. And so I couldn't verify it, and I didn't know what to do. And so I had seen a photograph, and I had seen and I knew the inscription at that point, right? I mean, I had heard from a couple of different sources, and I had seen a photograph. So, but I needed the real thing, I mean, and so again, the way the thing just kind of suddenly appeared, again, I don't want to say it's hard to, sorry to be full of ams and uns and stutters, but how did the way it came about was speaking to somebody, and somebody saying, oh yes, I have a picture of that. Would you like to see it? How about that for a question? Would you like to see it? Oh,
I guess. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, maybe tomorrow. I'm kind of tired. So yeah, and then for it to have been photographed like that, right, is extraordinary. I mean, you can really see, everything you want to see, and that's the first time, as you guys know, that every time it's been on John Lennon, all those photographs of the watch on John Lennon's wrist, you can't see the watch. You can't see the Tiffany stamp. Again, somebody knew it was Tiffany stamp too, Ben. Which is interesting. Like, you can't tell it's Tiffany stamped. So not only did somebody out there know it was the birthday, but they knew it was Tiffany stamped. Somebody out there knows something. But that fed those initial stories back in 08 and 09 and 10. But the point is, yes, so I now had the story. I had the inscription, which I felt was what made it more than a watch story too. That's, to me, understanding that inscription and how that echoed into that period of their marriage and Lennon's life. I hope that's what gives the story some emotional depth and makes it more than just, I just learned some crazy story about a watch.
Right. It's also just amazing, and just like, what a wild coincidence that both of these watches, the Newman and the Lennon, were both engraved on the back by their wives. I mean, that is like, it's not that common. I happen to own a watch that was engraved by my wife, but like, it is not that common of a practice to be done.
Yeah. I think that's true of all the watch stories that I read. You don't see that, and engraving in general, I mean, is not the most. I mean, I don't have any. Not that I have a ton of watches, but I haven't engraved any of them, and I've thought about, like, why or why not. And my daughter just graduated from high school and was on the way to college, and I was going to get her a watch that I had an engraving in mind, and so anyway, yeah, just thinking about engraving is kind of an interesting thing, right?
Yeah, it really is. But it just takes it to the, I mean, in both cases, it just elevates the story to being so much more than just about a watch.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, this one, as I say, it is an accidental memento mori. I mean, it is because of the fact that he was killed, but that it has that inscription, with the date and the whole thing. You can't not see. I don't think you could ever wear that watch if you were to own it and not have that come to mind every time you look at it.
Okay, so we left off the story with Mr. A, and I think this is when it gets gets really good and interesting, and I'd love for you to unpack it a little bit more. Mr. A is the one who gets the watch from Auctionata. He turns around a few months later and brings it to Christie's Geneva. But if you could start with sort of Mr. A, sort of what you know about him, and then just sort of overall impressions from speaking with him.
So in 2014, the private treaty sale is arranged. It is sold. Oliver Hoffman was given the impression by the man who bought it that it was going to be a piece, going to be put into his collection. And yet, 2 months after Mr. A buys it, it is taken to Christie's. At Christie's, they do their due diligence. They follow all the rules precisely, as I understand it, and they end up trying to establish its provenance in a way that makes sense. They reach out to Yoko Ono, and when her representative, presumably a lawyer, the lawyer then in turn passes on the information, and I think the story is basically, as I say, they say, hey, we had this watch. We're pretty sure it's John Lennon's. This is the inscription. Of course, no one knows the inscription, so it would be hard for somebody to know to fake it. Obviously, they have the other elements you would want, the serial number, etc. And so she says through the lawyer, no, you don't have my watch because it's here in my apartment. And then she runs and checks the locked room and the watch isn't there. So she's shocked, I think, and she has her lawyer send a note to Mr. A to say, you have stolen property, we demand its return. And then something happens. I know that Christie's puts it in what they call the strong room on the watch floor of their old offices in Geneva. Did you ever go there, Ben? Yeah, the one in
Yes, sorry, it's me. Yes, I have been there.
in the old part of town.
Mhm.
So okay, goes into the strong room, a safe, in other words, on that floor, and there it sits for I think 3.5 years or so while something goes on. I don't know what's going on. I can't figure out whether there was maybe going to be some deal struck, whether maybe Ono was going to buy the watch and make Mr. A whole for what he had already spent on it and maybe a little bit more. I don't know. But something doesn't go right. And then Mr. A decides he's going to go on the offensive and take her to court. So he's the one that makes the move to take her to court. Everybody else had reported before this that when the Swiss judgment came out, and I know that's a red herring at the moment, but that it was that she was the one suing him. It was the opposite. So there's a decision made in the civil case. It's appealed by Mr. A. Yoko Ono is so far found to be the only and rightful owner, as the Swiss court terms it, and it has been appealed one more time and now sits before the Swiss Supreme Court. And it's my understanding that this final decision will be made sometime in the fall. As a result of it going through the court, there was one court document, as you guys well know, that leaked out last September, and in that it is the appellate court's decision and basic kind of summary of what had been going on in the case. It was very difficult to read. Some people basically what they were able to establish from that when that leaked out to the watch world was that the watch was in Geneva. Nobody to that point knew where the watch was. They could at least read from this court document that yes, the watch was in Geneva and a few other things. They had the kind of basic movement of the watch that I've described. And at that point, I knew all that. So when that news broke, it kind of freaked me out because I felt like I was the only person who knew this, and now this court document was out there that even though it referred to everyone by an initial, that's why we're referring to Mr. A as Mr. A, and I think Ono is referred to as just see. It was very hard to know who all the players were unless you knew you had a lot of prior knowledge. Is also in French. It was also a Swiss judgment, which is very strange construction of writing, etc. But people were able to glean a few things that made them feel like they basically knew the story. To me, once I saw that, I felt like it was, the mystery was as ever, only deepening because it gave me some very helpful facts that I had only by at that point been able to kind of establish maybe with one source or something. Now I had the court record to make it fact. But I also already knew, and in fact had a planned meeting with Mr. A that had gotten canceled 2 days before that Swiss document was leaked. So I was a little bit like a cat on a hot tin roof when that happened.
Yeah, I think this is when we covered the story when the Swiss judgment came down. 9 months ago or whatever it would have been, and to give people some perspective, pretty much everything is kind of essentially redacted. So even we're talking about Christie's, for example, but even they are referred to as blank auction house based in Geneva, and our story kind of went to lengths to fill in all of those blanks and all of that type of stuff. But you said something a few minutes ago that I wanted to double back on. Is you said there's when we were talking about sort of putting the pieces to the puzzle together. And I think figuring out what exactly happened at Christie's is something you said was still kind of some blanks to be filled in there or questions to be answered. I'm wondering if you could just sort of explain what you meant there a little bit more.
Well, I did wonder. I mean, the questions I would have is, did Christie's perhaps finding themselves in this situation, did they try, as I'm sure auction houses sometimes do, try to broker some kind of compromise? Did they say, hey, you know what? All right, yes, but do you want to sell it? and maybe we can go ahead and auction it, and then you can get the money, or we can figure out either we can help you get the watch back by you buying it, or we can maybe auction it, or something like this, right? I mean, I would imagine if I were Christie's and it were legal, I would probably try to be a middleman of some sort. So, but I don't know that happened. I just am trying to figure it out because the Swiss judgment does mention that the watch was put in escrow until, and again, I don't want to screw up the language, but it does mention something that implies a possible reconciliation of some kind, right? And so, what would that reconciliation be? Just him giving the watch back after this person had paid 600,000 euros? I don't think that was going to. There was going to have to be some kind of attempt to make him whole, right? So that's what I'm wondering.
One of the other things you did was talk to Sean Lennon, and I wanted to ask you, you had one quote in here I wanted to read off, but then I wanted to ask for sort of you to just unpack anything else you learned from him.
Sure.
One of the quotes he gave you in the New Yorker was, he says about the watch, it's important that we get it back because of all we've gone through over it. He said, I'm not a watch guy. I'd be terrified to wear anything of my dad's. I never even played one of his guitars. To me, if anything, the watch is just a symbol of how dangerous it is to trust. But I'm wondering what else he sort of told you about the whole ordeal.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty powerful stuff, right? I mean, I guess I hesitate to say this as a journalist. I try, you try to remove yourself from the thing, but I really liked speaking with Sean. And I was glad he spoke to me, and I'm grateful that he did because I don't think that that's something he does all the time. And again, having written the piece and looked at all those pictures of Lennon, John, and Sean at that time. They both had the same birthday, by the way, so that was that was intense. Um, I just felt you can't help but feel bad about it all. Like I mean, it's sad that Lennon. It's sad that anyone would die like that, but it's particularly sad that a guy trying to get everything back in order in his life and be a good dad and all that kind of stuff um, was just snuffed out. So and then when you get those quotes, you just see how 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 dark the reverberation is, in the family and how difficult that must be. Um, when I spoke to him, I mean, he's a super charming guy and he's very articulate but he just spoke a lot about, I think what was really top of his mind was his experience with how many people had, from his point of view, had taken advantage of his parents, and as the kid who looking up at the adults and the adults, I mean, not just his parents, but the other uh, people in charge of things that were brought into their lives. I think that made him feel extremely vulnerable, and obviously then for your dad to die like that, and for fans to be around, I just that he doesn't come across as somebody who's fragile or anything, but the trauma, I think, spoke loudly through the things he was telling me. But it was really just about that. It was about, being, I think, the son of a guy who stood for what we all know he stood for, and a lot of people have made wisecracks about the piece who haven't read it, like, oh, the guy with no who sang
Yeah.
about no possessions has the Patek Philippe, like, yeah, it's like, dude, that's what the piece is about, man. It's not like I didn't realize that this was part of the irony. Yeah, there are ironies. People have unusual inconsistencies in the way that they live their life. It's interesting. They're human. Let the guy off the hook. Maybe try to understand it. Big whoop. It's what makes the story human. Again, compelling, fascinating, strange, unexpected, surprising. What's wrong with any of those things? So I felt that was what I picked up from Sean. It's just a very secluded life, but a real desire to, again, as I said before, to want to be a part of the real world, but the real world needing to be kept at bay, and that every time the real world, meaning somebody was just allowed into their life that hadn't been vetted, that seemed nice and friendly and a fan, ended up in his mind, you know, uh, doing something terrible to them to make them feel pull further into themselves, further away from the real world, and that's hard to think about.
The last question I'm going to ask both of you, Jay first, since this is your story and you're as close to the watch as anyone now, I can imagine, is kind of what your predictions or expectations are as to the final resolution. Obviously, we talked to the legal aspect of it, but I'm sort of speaking beyond that, whether it ends up with Yoko and then perhaps Sean, whether it'll appear at auction, sort of just any sense you have, and then even beyond that, what you'd like to see for it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I did ask him. I mean, in the course of our conversation, he said, I don't know anything about the legal stuff. I don't have anything to do with that. And I said, what would you do with it if it ever came back? He said, I don't know. It's not mine. So it was very interesting that he hasn't thought about it from that point of view, or he hasn't. If he has, he's not really wanted to think about it very much. Uh, I think it would be really cool if it came back to him. You know, I mean, I think it would, even if he never wore it. I think for what it represents as a symbol. I mean, he seemed afraid of it, to be honest with you. I think he told me at one point, he said, I'm a suspicious person. I have to be very difficult. It's difficult for me not to let my mind go there. So I never try this is when I said, well, what do you think the watch represents to, what does it represent to you? And he said, why does it have to represent anything? Why can't it just be what it is? It's a watch. I'm too, given to thinking about these things, and I go through my daily life just trying not to think about the significance of every little thing. I think just let it be what it is. Um, that also tells you about the weight of it, but I still think there would be something nice about it ending up back in his hands, because it was given to Lennon on his birthday, which is also Sean's birthday. And they had a pretty sweet birthday, as I understand it, that day. There's pictures of it and all that kind of stuff. And it just seems kind of like justice to me. I mean, as for Mr. A, I don't I don't sense that he's a nefarious character. I think um he he probably saw an opportunity, and perhaps he should have asked a few more questions. I bet he might even think that himself now, because he's certainly been embroiled in something that can't be that much fun. Whether he thinks he's right or not, I'm sure he's kind of like, what did I get myself into? And I suspect it hasn't been inexpensive to do the things he's done in terms of legal fees. So, I imagine, I mean, and Ben, it'd be interesting for you to talk about, I think the watch world is, and the world of antiquities and all that stuff, there's lots of gray areas, and this was probably kind of a gray area that a lot of people get very used to living in, and not thinking it's very weird. And most of the time it doesn't come back to bite you. And this is maybe just one of those times when there's just too much karma, man, as Lennon would say. There's too much karma with this piece.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think I'm not a super active buyer or seller at auction, but I get offered things all the time from auction houses, and I often say, well, like if it's I'm going to make this up, but like let's say it's an astronaut Speedmaster. I was certainly not offered John Lennon's for $499, but I have been offered an astronaut Speedmaster, and I was like, why would you want to sell it to me or one of my friends privately when like if this really is what you claim it to be, why wouldn't you want to go as wide as possible with this? And the answer is obviously that they're afraid of what might come out. It's not something that I think like the layman would be comfortable with at all. Having been around this stuff long enough, I'm not comfortable with it, but I'm used to it, if that makes any sense. And going back, Tony, to your question, it would be my hope that this watch goes back to the Lennon family and is never seen at auction. If it is at auction, I would love it to be sold for charity or something like that. But I think like this watch is so tricky because if you talk to the auction house guys or the purveyors of 7-figure or 8-figure in this case watches, there's talk of this being the most expensive wristwatch in history, right? Like trumping the Paul Newman, trumping even some of the charity Patek Philippe's, which are we're talking $20-30 million at this point. Somebody asked me, and I think maybe you even asked me when we first spoke, Jay, like what I think it would be worth, and I would have said, I don't know, $10 million, which is an absurd amount of money, of course. But the idea of this being potentially the most expensive watch in the world is hard for me to kind of wrap my head around. And I love the Beatles, obviously. I love the $24.99, the fact that Tiffany signed. But there's chatter amongst people that frankly know more than I do or anybody here on this call that so this could be the most expensive watch in the world. And if that's the case, people are going to go to extreme lengths to make sure that this thing does come to auction. Selfishly, for their side of things, but it would be a shame if this watch went anywhere but
I'm curious, Ben. I mean, this is not to pat myself on the back in any way, but I'm curious what a story like this being told in terms of just laying out the journey, the wrist to wrist journey this thing has gone on. How much more lore does that give to the possible value of the watch?
I mean, tremendous. I mean, as I said in the beginning, the fact that this story, and I say this like with great pride in what we've done, the fact that this story was told via the New Yorker versus Hodinkee or versus even some other like the New Yorker as a graduate of journalism school, like the New Yorker is the publication, and so the fact that it was told via the New Yorker, I think, just adds so much credibility to the idea of this story. And like the Paul Newman story didn't benefit from this. It was Paul Newman, of course, and it was a Daytona, and there was a lot to like there, of course, but it didn't have this level of intrigue. And I think if and when this does come to some conclusion of some variety, the whole world will be paying attention. There's no question about it.
Yeah, it's for sure a front page story when it happens. It's
no question.
It's not in the style section.
That's right. This is an Emmy-worthy story, or maybe an Oscar-worthy story, if I may say.
We got to find the right actor
to play you or me. Yeah, but it's a tremendous story, and again, like you did such a masterful job telling it. And again, I'm just so pleased that you were the person to tell it in the New Yorker. It's just such an amazing way to get to get the story out there.
Well, you probably. I mean, look, I at times, I mean, it took literally 3 years. You know what I mean? So, which still shocks me. I mean, a little bit. I mean, I do have another job, so it's not like I'm just sitting staring at the wall. But that is a long time, no matter what. And I think there were many days when I sat in this room and just thought, like, somebody else is going to get that. All I need is for somebody else to find that engraving and see these 3 years just go up in smoke. You know what I mean? Like, and I wondered, how many people I talked to where they must, hearing voices in my head. Whatever happened to Fielden and that? He asked you that question too? I haven't heard from that guy in years. Yeah. Well, one of the greatest feelings is just getting it done, and getting it out there. And certainly the fact that it's in the New Yorker, and like I say, the people that helped me get it right and all that, the fact checker, it's a great guy named Daniel Lajushin, Susan Morrison, I guess I'm giving my Oscar thank you speech.
Well, listen, Jay, thank you so much. Congrats again on an excellent piece. Thank you for bringing the watch world to the front page of the New Yorker, really. And thank you for taking the time to tell us really the story behind the story. We appreciate you. Obviously, everyone, the story, if you haven't read it, which surely you have by now, will be linked in the show notes below this episode. But thank you again to Jay. Thanks to Ben, as always. Thanks to our editor, Vic Odamanelli. And thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of Hodinkee Radio. And we'll see you again next week.